Good morning everyone and welcome to another Insight APSAB webinar. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we're meeting today and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I'd like to extend that welcome and respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders that might be joining us in the room or indeed on the webinar land. So welcome. My name's Jim Hunt. I'm one of the nurse educators here at Insight, and it gives me great pleasure today to introduce Dr. Vanessa Spiller, who's, I'm going to say, an expert in fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, and you'll get to learn why I believe that soon when she tells you a little bit about her experience. But she's a doctor with the Queensland University of Technology, so if you'd like to kindly welcome Dr. Vanessa Spiller to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. I don't know that I'm an expert in anything. The older I get, the less expert I feel about a whole range of things. But thank you very much for the welcome. And I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting today, the Yagara and the Turrbal people, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging as well. So today's talk, I'm going to sort of move between a couple of, obviously it's on fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, but I'm going to move between, I guess, some personal experiences and my experience as a parent and a carer of a young adult with a young person with FASD, but also from across my professional experiences, I guess, as a clinical psychologist, because probably much like yourselves, inadvertently I've been working with people with FASD and then more overtly working with people with FASD across my career as a psychologist. So I'm going to try to cover a sort of a broad range of areas, but really focus mostly on talking about, I guess, some of the real day-to-day kind of presentations of people with FASD and what that might look like when people come along to your services and how you might be able to interact and work with them. So that's just my starting slide. So who am I? So I guess my first experience with people with fetal alcohol spectrum disorders actually came at the start of my career in psychology, and I started working as a clinical psychologist. I say 20 years ago, but it's now getting closer to 25 years, sadly, in child protection and family counselling. And one of the things that I really noticed when I was working in those kind of services was that we had a really high number of young people who were coming in with really complex behavioural issues. They're often coming in with a list of diagnoses as long as your arm. And they really responded quite poorly to treatment as usual. And we were a really intensive service, so we had the opportunity to work with kids who are in care, but also kids who are at risk of being in care and their families and the systems around them really quite intensely, up to a couple of times a week. But we found that a lot of the strategies that we were suggesting for people really didn't work particularly well with these young people. And I guess at that time, we had some awareness that alcohol and exposure to substances may have an impact on them and their later development, but it really wasn't very clear what that looked like. I then went into a range of roles, and I've continued to, I guess, work with people in a range of settings. And I guess as my awareness of fetal alcohol spectrum disorders has grown, I've been able to recognise and see that certainly this condition and these kind of issues are actually presenting everywhere we go, and they're actually more prevalent in some places than others. I do a lot of work and training around FASD. I do some training with various people. I do some education on FASD in the university setting and outside of the university setting. Do a little bit of research. I'd like to do more research. And certainly an advocate, because this is an area that is probably a little bit like autism spectrum disorders were about 20 years ago. So we're really at the beginning trying to get this kind of condition well recognised and well funded and better supported so that we can start to get some better outcomes for people with FASD. Currently, my full-time employment is at QUT with the psychology and counselling clinic up there. And that again allows me to do some education around FASD, and we probably see, again, like all clinics and all services, we're seeing people with FASD, and again, it's not particularly well recognised at this point, but it's something that we're sort of working towards doing. I'm also connected with UQ and Children's Health Queensland and Natasha Reid, Dr. Natasha Reid over there, who's looking at starting a clinic to look at diagnosis around FASD as well. I guess more importantly though, I'm also the parent of a young adult with FASD, and this is where I guess really got my in-depth experience with this particular diagnosis and then what people's lives are like when you have a diagnosis like this. So we're actually really fortunate. My young man who came into our lives when he was about 2, we were doing respite care for a young man who we knew had a diagnosis of FAS, which is fetal alcohol syndrome at that stage, because that was the terminology in use there. So that was quite unusual at the age of 2 to actually have that diagnosis. And really it was told to us by, child safety, this is the diagnosis. There was some recognised prenatal alcohol and substance use for this little person, but he's been in care now, since birth. Here you go, good luck with it. And that was really the amount of information that we had on FAS at that point in time. And I don't think that child safety was holding out on us. They actually just didn't know much about it either. And we're also talking pre-internet days or very early internet days. So even when you went and Googled something like fetal alcohol syndrome or fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, as it later became known, there really just wasn't anything there. And what we very quickly discovered with our young man was that, he had a really complex array of behavioural and emotional issues. And like all good parents, and probably like most foster carers, you go into it and think, all he needs is love and consistency. 17 years later, we're still working on that love and consistency. But we worked out very, very quickly, and we were very fortunate. I come from a clinical psychology background. I've been working with kids with significant mental health issues and significant emotional issues, all of my career. My partner was a trained teacher. So we came with a whole lot of resources, and we thought, we're going to be able to manage this. And of course, it really turned our world on its head. And we'll talk a little bit about what that looked like sort of as we go along. But one of the things we really quickly discovered was that the strategies that, we'd used with other kids that we'd had in our care and with our nieces, other family members, nephews, nieces, things like that, those strategies just didn't work. And so we were left with not really knowing where to go and what kind of approaches to try. And we're going to talk a little bit about what that might look like in adult populations as we go along. But we really needed a very different approach to managing him and parenting him. And he has been an enormously wonderful teacher for us around FASD. And what it's like to live with this kind of condition and the challenges that brings people with FASD, as well as their carers. I'm going to show you a very short, brief video to start with, and this is just to give you a bit of a sense. This was done, we had the second Australasian FASD conference over in Perth in November last year, and the FASD Hub made this lovely video, and it's just a little bit about my background, but I guess more importantly about the background of my son. So I'm going to cue up the video. I have a little bit of inside knowledge about what I think psychologists know about FASD and what I think they should know about FASD. I live with my son, who's now 18, and he's been with us since he was about 2. And it's full of challenges and highs and lows. And it's just been a massive learning journey, I guess, as a parent, as a human being. Discipline is usually our first reaction as human beings, and I think as parents and anyone who does some education, but it just doesn't work very well with kids with FASD. When people believe that those behaviours were a result of a neurodevelopmental disability, then what they were more likely to do was to use things like antecedent strategies to manage those behaviours. And they're things like changing the environment, skilling up kids. And when they did that, that actually led to greater confidence in parenting. Just because we're not using consequences doesn't mean we're not managing his behaviour. Being a clinical psychologist means that it's enabled me to, I guess, look at a bit deeper at his behaviours. So it helps me to look at what might be driving his behaviours and get a better explanation, rather than him just being naughty or willful or misbehaving. There's actually the brain injury is driving the behaviours that we see, and therefore finding a useful way or an alternative way of managing those behaviours. He's an excellent bike rider too, and that's certainly his passion. He's physically very, very capable and able. He has lots and lots of skills in BMX riding, but also mountain bike riding, and that's something that he can be an expert in, and he doesn't get to be an expert in a lot of things in his life, so having an opportunity to be actually really good at something, and his peers recognise that, so it gives him a little bit of status, even though he really struggles academically and socially in lots of different ways. The fact that he stands out in terms of his bike riding really gives him a good sense of self-esteem, and he's really very confident. Led astray. He wants to have friends, but he's really vulnerable to being exploited by his peers. And they're all starting to get into a whole range of behaviours like smoking and drinking, but they're actually, the level of concern for him, if he was to become engaged in those things, actually goes up quite a few notches. The future is probably our next really big challenge. So he moves from a really supported environment in his current school into the workplace, and how to transition into a workplace as a person with a disability. And who's going to support him to do that, apart from us, of course. We really want to know what psychologists know so that they're actually giving useful and helpful advice. Number one would be getting themselves educated about FASD and what it is to have FASD, and as well as getting a bit of an understanding of how that impacts on the family environment. So you need both the book knowledge about what FASD is, but also the everyday applications and how that changes the way families interact. These kids are able to learn and they are able to make changes, but it's just a really long process. And don't forget relationship, kids will do anything for someone they love. So the stronger your relationship with them, the better it is for everyone. So that's a little bit about me, I guess, and my background, as well as my young man, who has certainly given permission to be on all of the slides in case anyone was concerned. He's very happy to be a star and an advocate, I guess, for FASD. I'll also give the FASD Hub a bit of a plug at the end as well, because they have some really wonderful resources. If you're looking for some more videos or some more information, both professionals and carers, they have a whole heap of information, as does another organisation called NoFAS. So they're really good Australian-based resources. So just to flip into how someone with FASD may present to your service and what kind of things, how might that look on the ground? And these are kind of very typical things that people talk about over and over again. This idea that they seem bright enough. So these are people who don't look like they have an obvious cognitive impairment. They don't look disabled, but they tend to be perceived by people as just not able to get their their act together. They just can't seem to string things together, and they might go okay for a little while and then it all sort of falls over again. So they're notoriously seen in schools as being inconsistent, but also in employment and in the workplace, and even outside of that, as being just really hard to get their act together. And these are people who are often, you know, in their 30s, going into their 40s, who, you know, are still struggling with paying the rent and being able to live their lives in functional ways and hold down jobs. Quite often they'll turn up to your service with a whole raft, again, that, you know, as soon as someone turns up at my service with a list of diagnoses, as I said, as long as my arm, for me, that's almost an instant red flag for fetal alcohol spectrum disorders. And the most common ones that you'll see, again, over and over again, ADHD. ADHD is probably the most common one, but you'll also get a large proportion of people who will also meet criteria for autism spectrum disorders. Oppositional defiant disorder, that's one that obviously we see a lot in kids, and then going on to conduct disorder. Personality disorders, and I was just talking with Jim before, you know, this is probably, you know, it hasn't been explored in the research, but certainly we would expect a lot of the characteristics that fit with some of the personality disorder, borderline personality disorder, like impulsiveness and those kind of difficulties with executive functioning. Certainly there's a huge crossover with FASD. And of course comorbidities, so comorbidities particularly around substance misuse disorders, but also quite a lot of small, so often not huge physical health issues, but a lot of minor physical health issues, and that can be in a full range of areas. So again, for me, this is a flag. Automatically, when I see these kind of referrals coming into our service at the clinic over at QUT, I'm automatically thinking, okay, we need to screen for prenatal alcohol exposure. They'll quite often, probably in the services that you're working at, will often present in crisis. So they're often pointing at the sharp end of the stick. And we do see really high rates of suicidality and suicidal intent and suicidal vocalisations for people with FASD. The research does indicate that they have much higher incidence of suicide attempts. And certainly if we look at the mortality of people with FASD, we see much higher, much younger rates of death. So I know this is not meant to be interactive too much, but does anyone want to have a guess at the average age expectancy of someone with FASD at birth?
Oh, it depends on whether they're Indigenous or not too.
Yes.
Huge, isn't it? WA.
Oh, it's very big in WA and certainly in Canada. And we haven't got stats that pull that apart, but in general, want to take a stab?
45?
45? Any higher, any lower?
I was going 50.
50? Yeah, and that's what people often guess, around the, something sort of significantly reduced. And there hasn't been a huge amount of research on it, but it's 34. So that's quite a shocking statistic. And what we know about what the causes of death are, it's external causes. So things like accidents and suicide. So they're the two leading causes of death for people with fetal alcohol spectrum disorders. And again, this fits well. When we have a look at the kind of brain impairment that goes with that, it kind of makes a bit more sense why people are so at risk of this. So when they are presenting at services, it may often be in crisis at that very pointy end of the stick. They may be unsupported depending on how old they are, or they may be supported by a very exhausted family or support team who have been assisting them for many years. Many people with FASD are not able to live independently. So they often, if they're lucky, they have a relationship of interdependence with family. And we see that unstable housing. So if you look at some of the stats that comes out of Canada and the US, the vast majority of people are, living or still connected with their families of origin or their adopted families. And many obviously are homeless or lack housing. But there's very few people who are actually living very independently in the community. They'll often have erratic appointment attendance, and again we'll talk about why that is, poor medication compliance, and those kind of issues often go hand in hand with some of the deficits that they're experiencing. They'll often be unemployed, and they'll often have had previous contact with mental health services, again quite often in crisis. So when things are going okay, you may not see many of people with these kind of conditions, but certainly in crisis you'll see them fairly regularly, and they'll often be pulled in by other people who are also in crisis with them. You might say, this sounds like almost every second person we see. And I imagine that you would see an enormous amount of people who would meet those kind of criteria. I guess the bad news is that, while it may not be every second person you see, we do know that there's really high rates of incidence of FASD in certain subpopulations. So kids in care. And again, depending on what country, there's some stats that have just come out. Kids in care in Chile who also have a developmental disability, we're seeing about rates of up to 70%. These are really high. In general, it's definitely not that high, but we do know that 85% of people with FASD are undiagnosed or misdiagnosed with something else. In Australia, I think that's actually a conservative. That's a stat that comes out of the United States, I believe. I think in Australia it's actually probably much higher because we really haven't been diagnosing it for very long here in the country. We do know that around 94% of people have at least one mental health condition, 50% have been confined in jail or a mental health facility, 35% have substance abuse or misuse issues, and again, I think that's a fairly conservative estimate. And again, employment issues. So it might sound like every second person you see, but the chances are you are probably seeing higher rates of people with FASD coming to your services. So just to give you a little bit, I don't want to go too much into what is FASD. I'm presuming that people actually have a little bit of a background in that, but I'll just run through some of the really sort of more general stuff. It is the leading preventable cause of developmental disability in the world. So in some ways that's a really good thing. As soon as something is preventable, it means that we can put in services and interventions to reduce that. The downside is obviously we have a long way to go, a lot more work to do. In terms of prevalence, and we're looking in the general population somewhere between about 2 and 5% of the population, and that again, that's conservatively. If we look at certain subpopulations, you'll see it at much higher rates. In fact, it's much higher in any kind of population where there's high alcohol use. So again, there are particular sub-communities that have issues with alcohol, and there is a tendency for people to think that FASD and fetal alcohol spectrum disorders are particularly an issue for Aboriginal communities. And it's true that there are some communities that have very high rates of FASD, and they are typically communities that have very high rates of alcohol misuse problems. But FASD is not unique to Aboriginal communities by any stretch of the imagination. It is a condition that certainly extends across every country, every class, and I won't go into some of those stats today, but wherever we have high exposure to alcohol and drinking, we have high rates of FASD. It is at least 2.5 times more common than autism, and I often use this as a stat because when I ask professionals and people in their own lives, do you know someone with autism, or are you working with any clients who have autism spectrum disorders? People will often say, quite a few. To then conceptualise that and say, look, so for every one of those, you're probably seeing 2.5 people with FASD. So you're seeing a lot more people with FASD than you are with ASD. You just don't know it, and we're not recognising it. We know alcohol is a tetragen, and I've already talked about the undiagnosed or misdiagnosed. Some of the other things that I think are really important to understand about FASD is that not everyone with FASD has an intellectual impairment. And similarly around the facial features, and I'll talk about the facial features in a minute, but this is a really important factor because I think a lot of people have this conception that they will have by virtue of this alcohol exposure or this tetragen exposure, they will have an intellectual impairment, and it will be quite obvious. Many people with FASD have pockets of abilities, and on things like IQ testing, I think it's around 15% will actually have an impaired IQ. Most will have IQs that are in the normal range, and in the low normal range, are sitting somewhere around 80. So, when you're having a conversation with people who are, scoring in those kind of ranges, again, sometimes that impairment is not obvious, and that's a part of what makes it so challenging to be able to spot someone with FASD and to be able to support them, because they quite often have, people presume they have more intellect and more ability than they actually do. Similarly, not everyone has facial features, and again, I'll talk about that in a second, but that's to do with timing of alcohol exposure and the very small window that's involved in that. And FASD is a lifelong condition, so it is the easiest way, I think, to conceptualise it is to think of it as an acquired brain injury or diffuse brain injury. It's present for life. People don't outgrow it. They can obviously develop skills across the lifespan and develop some other abilities, but they can't grow brain structures, and they can only develop within limits. And people with FASD are similar but very different. And again, I think this is one of the things that makes it so challenging to spot someone with FASD in your service, because two people with FASD might present incredibly differently, as opposed to people who have syndromes like Down syndrome or even ASD. There's a lot of similarity. People with FASD can be very different, and I'm going to tell you why. So, and again, I'm not going to go into enormous detail about this, but a part of why it presents so differently in people is because of alcohol exposure. And when alcohol exposure. So we look at pregnancy as a 40-week process. You can break it down into days. We know more and more about what is developing across pregnancy. So part of the reason why people present so differently is because the timing of alcohol exposure will really then depend on which systems are actually impacted. And which combinations of systems are impacted. So exposure at different times is going to have a differing impact on the developing young person. So if we have a look at something like facial features, and again, this is broken down into weeks. If we're looking for the presentation of facial features, we're actually looking for alcohol exposure in week 7 or 8. And there is some studies that have actually broken that down even smaller. And I think, don't quote me, that we're looking really there's about 3 periods or 3 days in which you need to be exposed to alcohol to develop the facial features. So that's why they're actually so less common than we think, but it's one of the things that people often look for when they're trying to diagnose FASD, because it's something you can it's very concrete, but it's just not always going to be present. There's a whole range of other factors that also impact on how FASD presents and why people with FASD present with different symptoms. And some of that is to do with obvious things like the amount of alcohol that's consumed, and in addition to the timing of that exposure. However, we also know genetics plays a role. So how the genetics of a person will really have a big influence on whether or not people do go on to develop FASD or not. They've done a few twin studies that have recently came out, and they looked at identical twins versus, what's the other word, non-identical twins. And the, obviously identical twins, if they're both exposed to alcohol, you see big, very similar rates of FASD. For non-identical twins, digozygotical, you will see differing rates. So because they just have slightly different genetic makeups. So you can have, 2 individuals exposed to the same amount of alcohol and have a different presentation. Other factors such as antenatal care and whether people get antenatal care, nutrition, maternal BMI, and other things like trauma and exposure, prenatal stress, exposure to other substances, exposure to domestic violence. There's a whole range of other factors, so you can see it's a really complicated picture that comes together to then present in very different ways in different individuals. So in Australia, we have some guidelines that came out in 2016, the FASD guidelines. They're actually, in terms of guidelines, they're pretty easy to read, and I think they're quite helpful. But to get a diagnosis of FASD in Australia, we do need confirmed prenatal alcohol exposure. That's obviously the first criteria. And then we're looking for severe impairment in a minimum of 3 neurodevelopmental domains. And again, this is where it gets a little messy. So there's 10 different domains that we're looking at, and I won't go into great detail because I could probably be here all day explaining each of the domains, but we are looking for a minimum of 3 domains. What we know in reality is, that's the minimum. Many people who are actually diagnosed with FASD have impairment across a whole range of domains, often 5+. But it can range from things like brain structure, and again, in Australia, we don't do much imaging work. We don't look at brain structure, but certainly things like the corpus callosum are affected by prenatal alcohol exposure, even at very small levels. Again, that's a recent study. We see motor skill impairment, and that can be in both fine and gross motor skills. So these are people who kind of look clumsy, they have difficulty with penmanship, and particularly those kind of skills that require both motor skills and some coordination, like writing. Executive functioning, so their ability to coordinate and plan, the ability to link cause and effect, the ability to be able to manage your behaviours, particularly under strong emotions, is one of those areas, and it's one of the areas that's quite often affected. Adaptive functioning, so people's everyday living skills, so these are often people that are having real trouble with managing money, difficulty telling the time. Sometimes, quite often, they're okay at self-care skills, but quite often need supervision around that. So these are people that may be cognitively doing okay. They may have, again, IQs that are in the average range or the low average stage, but when you look at their adaptive functioning skills, they actually can't do a whole range of things. They really struggle with those everyday tasks. Issues with memory, which can often be quite patchy. And if I give an example from my son, he can't tell you the alphabet. So he's 19, he could not recite you the alphabet, but he can read. So they have very confusing patterns of presenting with these issues, and things that we would presume that you need to be able to do this thing over here, they often won't be able to do that even though they can do this thing over here. And again, that's very frustrating for people who don't understand what's underneath that. Issues with attention, language, and probably one of the key things about language is really around that expressive language and receptive language. So again, it differs from person to person, but if you have impairments in this area, quite often people with FASD have very good expressive language, and their receptive language is really poor. And what that looks like in practice is they're great at talking. They can talk the talk, they can use big words, they can use it in context. They sound like they know what they're talking about. But when you test their receptive language, they often have no idea. They have very poor understanding. And so again, you can imagine what happens in schools and in criminal justice systems, and when they're being questioned by police. They're nodding and agreeing, and they're using, sophisticated language, and their understanding is extremely poor. So they're often in trouble for things like false confessions and confabulation. Issues with affect regulation, so that's really looking at issues around anxiety, depression, that mental health realm. And as you might imagine, academic achievement, again, can be varied. So they might do really well in one area, but they'll often struggle in other areas. And maths is probably one of the areas that anecdotally carers will talk about all the time. They really struggle with maths. And I guess part of the reasoning we think that might be the case is because maths is actually very abstract, particularly as you get beyond the basic maths. And abstract concepts are something that people with FASD struggle with enormously. And again, this can come with or without sentinel facial features. So as you can imagine, again, for every person with FASD, there is in multiple ways that these cognitive impairments and these neurodevelopmental impairments can appear. So again, this becomes very confusing because you're not going to see a consistent pattern in every person with FASD. You're going to have to look at all the different domains and try to line them up. We've talked very briefly, but when we look at those neurodevelopmental domains, what happens is they map onto core deficits. And these are really important to understand because when you have deficits in IQ, for example, what does that actually mean? What does that mean on the ground? Well, it means that even if they have a normal IQ or an average IQ, they're not able to access that. So they're often very poor at problem solving. They often really have very slow processing speeds. So those kind of things, again, make a really big impact when, they're presenting to services. And what happens is these core deficits then combine with each other and present in really confusing and conflicting ways that people interpret in different ways as well. So just like the neurodevelopmental areas, there's enormous combinations of core deficits that can combine together to give particular presentations. So this one here I've used as an example. If you have these kind of impairments in cognition, but also in memory, and also in executive functioning, but also in their social and adaptive functioning, you get an individual who seems smart enough but seems to keep making bad choices. They may appear to be lying a lot, and certainly we would refer to that as confabulation as opposed to lying typically, but they're often unreliable. They're not turning up, and they impulsively do things and say things that get them in a lot of trouble. And again, you can imagine how that plays out in a school. You can imagine how that plays out just in life, in the workplace, and in their relationships with peers, in their relationships with their landlord. It has a really big impact. So there's just a huge number of these. And again, I think as clinicians, that's probably something we need to constantly have in the back of our head. What might be driving this? What might be the core deficits that are underneath this behaviour? That's all right. So diagnosis, why does it matter? And for me, again, as a parent, but also as a professional, it matters an enormous amount. And that's because of how we treat people and how we conceptualise what's going on for them. If we don't diagnose, what happens is we often see these behaviours like confabulation or stealing or being unreliable or not being able to manage money. We see it as something they won't do. So we presume they have the capabilities to do that because, of course, their IQ might be in the normal range. So we get this perception that they won't do it for some reason. And we then treat the behaviours that we're seeing as behaviours, that these are choices that people are making and they're poor choices and they really need to be making other choices. And when we treat them like behaviours, what happens is our attitude as a parent and our attitude as a professional is often around judgment. You need to get your act together. We become angry, we become frustrated, and we often get into power struggles of trying to get them to do the things we know that they can do and that they should be doing and that everyone else is doing and they just need to get on board with. There's a bit of giggling in the crowd. And when we have that approach and when we have that underlying belief, what happens is we tend to go to consequences and punishment. We do this with our kids, and that's probably the easiest way for people to relate. If we think that our child is deliberately doing something, we will quite often give them a consequence for that as a way of signalling this behaviour is not okay, it's clearly your choice, you need to make a better choice next time. But if we view it as a diffuse brain injury, suddenly we're coming at it from a very different perspective. And these behaviours, these same behaviours that we see, but I call them symptoms, behavioural symptoms, we suddenly recognise that people actually can't. And again, that then sends us down a very different line of thinking. We can then view their their behaviours or the things that we're seeing as actually symptoms of their brain injury. And when we see it like that, I always put frustration there because we'll continue to be frustrated. It is frustrating when we see these kind of things. We want it to be different, but we can very quickly then shift into empathy and into understanding. And we see this in people with dementia. You know, you'll find that people have enormous patience. We still get frustrated if we're interacting regularly with someone who has dementia. But most of the time we're not angry at them. We're not trying to punish them. We actually have a great deal of empathy, and we try to change circumstances around them so that they can be more successful. And we have a great deal more understanding. And when we do that, particularly with people with FASD, but in other kinds of disability as well, we're much more likely to support them, to teach them the skills that they need. And teaching these skills takes a really long time. I often say, you know, if you're trying to teach someone who has a diagnosis of ADHD something, a child without any particular issues, you might have to teach them something somewhere between 3 and 8 times until they kind of get that concept. A child with ADHD who has some issues with attention, impulsivity, you know, maybe it's going to take you 25 to 50 times. A person with a diffuse brain injury and FASD, we're talking 1,000 repetitions. Lots. Repetition over and over and over again. And that's to do with that underlying brain structure. And we're more likely to teach problem solving and help them because quite often, as you would all know, you know, behaviour is communication. You know, something is going on. There is a reason behind this behaviour. And if we can assist them with working out better ways to solve the issues that they're facing, then often we see a reduction in those behavioural symptoms. This is just a little example in terms of looking at, you know, people who don't turn up for appointments. Again, you know, if we look at it as behaviour, then we're likely to come up with explanations that are, you know, this person's not motivated, they're treatment resistant, they don't respect our time. And quite often that will channel both verbally and non-verbally into the way that we interact with them. And you will get frustrated, and we may even exclude them from services because of our presumption. And what happens then for the person is that they become even more distressed. So people with FASD in particular have a very sensitive stress system. So their ability to kick into fight or flight, it's a lot like people with trauma. So, you know, they can go from 0 to 100 very quickly. And so when they feel threatened or they feel misunderstood or they're still not getting their needs met, there's a really good chance that they're going to have a meltdown. And that will turn into more behavioural symptoms, and aggression can be very common. And they're also going to try to save face because, you know, it's embarrassing as well, you know, and, you know, they don't want to be seen often as disabled and not able to do things. The overall consequence, though, however, is that they haven't learnt anything. They haven't been supported. They haven't suddenly acquired the skill. You know, we can't punish away disability. You know, they haven't suddenly become less disabled because we've punished them, and they will tend to repeat the behaviour, and then they get into this real cycle of interactions with us as well. Versus if we're able to come back to some of those core deficits, you know, so someone who's not turning up for appointments regularly, what might be underlying that for someone with FASD is something like they don't understand the abstract concept of time. That this is something that people with FASD struggle with enormously. Again, you know, my son is 19. He has enormous difficulty reading clocks. He has a clock. He can read a digital clock. Could not read an analogue clock. And just still struggles to know how long a day is and how long that will be and how long an hour is. So you tend to have to, again, you know, he's working part-time, so people make presumptions that he will know when he has to log on and when he has to log off. We link them to television programs, or we link them to alarms that go off, or we link them to us. You know, when do you come home? After lunch. It may also be related to poor impulse control. You know, if you have poor impulse control and something more interesting comes along, you know, for us, we're able to moderate that and kind of go, no, that does look like a really interesting billboard or interesting movie or a phone call that I've got from someone. but it's actually more important that I, keep my eyes on this other thing over here. People with FASD, their impulse control, they may have to manage that impulse control 6 times to get to an appointment, and sometimes that's just too much. And then executive functioning issues. So if you're not able to link cause and effect, and cause and consequences, you're going to have a lot of trouble making decisions. And you're going to make decisions because you don't necessarily see, okay, if I don't turn up for this probation and parole appointment, well, then, that happens. Not able to see that might have consequences of violating parole, and that might have consequences for being re-locked up, and that might have consequences for money and finance, and you can imagine it just goes on and on. You can add into that poor problem-solving skills, poor emotional regulation. And so you can see that, when someone's not turning up, there's actually a huge number of those core deficits that actually underlie that behaviour. And again, if we recognise that there are core deficits driving that, yes, we're going to be frustrated, but we're much more likely to try to find accommodations and solutions and workarounds that are going to help the person to be more successful. And they're going to feel supported and understood, and they get a sense of actual achievement. And again, that's something that often people with FASD who've had this other side of experience don't always get that experience off, because people aren't patient enough to give them those repeated experiences of that. So how do you best support someone with FASD who comes to your service, or you suspect? Because the chances are you're not going to have someone who turns up and says, I have FASD, surprisingly enough. They're more likely to turn up, as I said, with one of the many other diagnoses. So how can you best support them? Consulting with the person's supports. So if that person does have supports, and provided they are giving you consent to do that, the people around them will have an enormous amount of information, even if it's just around explaining where their core deficits are and what you need to be particularly aware of. They might talk about the fact that, this person, for example, has, very poor emotional regulation, or this person seems like they know what you're talking about, but you need to check that constantly, particularly if you're talking about medication. This person has a really poor concept of time. So if you're going to be giving them medication, you need to have a system around that for them to be successful. So wherever possible, connect in with their supports and confirm their history and that, that other information about them to help you provide the best service you can to them. Constantly check for understanding. And don't assume that people do understand what it is you're saying about. So asking yes and no questions is probably not going to get the information, because again, people in FASD, like other people with disability, are really good. They want to look competent. They want to look like they fit in. They're trying to please you quite often. They'll be nodding and yep, no, oh yeah, I get that, yep, absolutely. You really need to ask them questions that ask them to demonstrate their understanding. Get them to repeat it back to you. Get them to explain how, what it is that you're going to do. And obviously doing that in a way that doesn't make them feel silly or like a child. Provide them with scaffolding. So these are things, we call these sort of environmental accommodations. So wherever possible, they need scaffolding, and they need it left in place. So this is one of the biggest issues for kids with FASD in school. They'll often put in scaffolding to assist them with being successful, and then when they're successful, they take the scaffolding away. And they go, I don't understand why this isn't working. Because the scaffold is what helps them to be successful. So this can be things like text reminders, or using other things as time references, TV shows, or other things that are coming up. Come in after Easter, come in, those kind of things. So linking it to something that is less abstract and more concrete, that they have an understanding of. Assess suicidality. And again, you will have to do this really frequently, because again, if you've got someone with really poor impulse control who is comorbidly using substances, you can imagine that the risk goes up. And do check with the people around them as well, because again, when they come into services, it may be that things have settled down a little bit, but remembering that, you know, when people have poor emotional regulation, they can go from 0 to 100 really fast. Checking in with the people who are around them around, well, what is their emotional regulation like? What is their impulsivity like? What is this likely to look like in 10 minutes' time? So, you know, assessing suicidality certainly with them, but also with the people who are bringing them in. Adopt a team approach, you know, as many people that you can get involved and as many services, the better. And this is particularly important as, you know, the NDIS, which is sort of still rolling out, although it doesn't recognise FASD as a standalone instant entry kind of condition. What the NDIS purports is that, you know, if you can demonstrate functional impairment, then you can access services. And quite often what we need for these guys is for people to be recording their functional impairment and keeping a record of that functional impairment and sharing what they know about the person with other services so that that can be then linked together, so that, you know, things like an application to the NDIS can be made. And of course we want to know their strengths as well, and I put that in, but it's really difficult when you're applying for things like the DSP and the NDIS that identifying too many strengths can sometimes be a little challenging for their application. So, you know, we do want to recognise their strengths and give them the best chances of success, but we also need to really well document their deficits and, you know, share them with others. And use the Mental Health Act as needed. You know, unfortunately, you know, lots of individuals need a period of confinement, unfortunately, and involuntary admission to help them stabilise and to help get them on track, and to ensure their safety. And I guess, you know, people with FASD are no different. So just in terms of a couple of resources, sort of coming to the end of my formal talk, but certainly we've got some really good resources online. So the FASD Hub is probably, it's a great national organisation, and you can go on there and get a whole heap of resources, both professionally and for carers. They also have links to services. They have materials that you can give people. And NoFAS is similar. They're another really great national organisation that produces a lot of materials for professionals and carers. I've got a couple of YouTube videos that I've produced, and you can actually it says go to YouTube, but I find it really hard to find anything in YouTube. If you go to my website, which is www.jumpstartpsychology.com, there's actually the links to those videos there. And there's only 2 videos up at the moment. One is on why people with FASD all present so differently. So it's sort of a 5 to 7 minute version of the bit that we briefly talked about. And then there's a 7-minute video on stigma, and because stigma is something that people will often talk about, particularly professionals, why they don't diagnose FASD and why they don't even ask about prenatal alcohol exposure. And this is a real barrier for diagnosis. And it's just a quick video that talks about, particularly if you've ever spent time with birth parents, about the stigma that people with FASD experience when they're undiagnosed and the stigma that their families and carers experience when they're undiagnosed. So if we think that we're sparing people from stigma by not diagnosing them, you really need to think again, you know, because these are people who are struggling and are often caught up in the criminal justice system and expelled from preschool and expelled from school and unable to get jobs. So, you know, in order to get them support, we really do need to be looking at diagnosis, because it really is connected to better outcomes. So they're the couple of videos that I've got. We've also got a couple of wonderful online support groups. The first 2 are in Australia, and these are particularly for parents, but the RAFTA group actually has a professionals a Facebook group as well. So if you're wanting to connect with other people who are working in the FASD space, that's a really good option. These are wonderful for parents. The first one is quite Queensland specific, and it's run by a lady on the Gold Coast, Sam Pennell, and she's a carer for a young person with FASD. And the RAFTA group is run by a lady called Anne Russell, who's up in Cairns, and she's a birth parent of young adults, or actually probably not so young these days, of adult sons with FASD. And they're wonderful support spaces for parents and carers who are trying to work out and navigate their way through systems and try to work out what works. And the last one there, FASD Caregiver Success, that's one that's based out of the US by a gentleman called Jeff Noble. He was out here last year, the year before last, and he has lots, again, resources on FASD, particularly for carers. So that's my spiel. So I guess it's question time.
Thank you very much, Vanessa, for what's a thought-provoking and very insightful presentation. Have we got some questions?
Absolutely. Absolutely. We had a talk on this at the symposium at WOWS by a neuroscientist or a neuropsychologist who was talking about the incidence of it.
Yes.
And they'd done a bit of a survey and found out within a context, I've actually got the numbers down there, but I probably wouldn't have to give them to you, that it's rife. It's really rife throughout our community.
Absolutely.
Especially since baby booms have come through and we've had more money, we've spent more money, you know, to spend on alcohol. One of the, this touches me both personally and professionally, that's why I have to have a bit of a giggle with in the context of somebody who definitely has FASD, hasn't never been diagnosed, but was seen as willfully underachieving at school.
Yes.
That was sort of the comments of the Christian brothers with that. Within the context of us, what I think that we need to do is take a very thorough history.
Yes.
And I reckon that, like, we're looking at easily 50% of our clients, you know, having some level of effect with it. And that's, I think, how I've always approached our clients as well, in the context of making sure that we send text messages, giving simple messages.
Yeah.
But then again, as I said, I've known about this and had a real fascination of it, about it for years. Yeah, but thank you.
Oh,
yeah.
my pleasure.
Yeah.
And look,
A
certainly.
couple of questions, of course, but I won't take any more time.
Well, you can feel free to email me, even if we don't get all the questions today. You know, please don't hesitate to email me. I can talk underwater about FASD, and I probably would.
Our clients' behaviour fits that.
Yeah.
You know, so many of them, you know, that willful.
I tend to agree. It's not something I've had a huge awareness with, but I was listening to that and just thinking of the number of clients that I see on a regular basis.
Yeah, because they're so bright and they come up and like they've got all of the verbal skills and they carry nothing through.
And
then suddenly they're not doing something, you're sort of saying they're not committed.
Yeah.
And our system currently doesn't seem to support them the way it
Yeah.
should.
And you see that in prison. Like there was a study done in WA, the Bauer and Elliott study, I think, and they looked at a juvenile detention facility in WA, and they found, I think it was 33%
It is.
of
That's one of the stats.
Of young people in juvenile detention.
17% have mental sort of problems, but 36% are FASD.
Yeah. So it's certainly in some populations of, particularly of people wherever there's disadvantage, you'll probably find elevated rates. Kids in care, juvenile justice, adult prisons, adult mental health. Wherever there's disadvantage, we'll find it. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. I've got several questions online. Some I think you've probably covered, but I'll read them through and we'll see how we go. It seems a big challenge to get parents on board to look at a diagnosis due to the sense of shame and guilt. But somebody's asked, I wonder how a child feels when they find out they have this diagnosis. And obviously you may have some personal experience about that.
Yeah, that is I've got two answers again, just in terms of the shame and stigma, just in terms of parents. And again, I've had a lot of contact with birth parents. And for many of them, what they will say about shame and stigma is, these are kids that are often the naughtiest kid in the class, who've been expelled from preschool and from primary school and don't have any friends to play with. And, so for them, they will talk a lot about stigma and the experience of stigma even well before their child is diagnosed. For them, what they'll often say is, now at least I have an answer. And now at least I can look for the right kind of services. And when people tell me that he's naughty and defiant and just needs a good smack, I can actually say, he has a diffuse brain injury. And that, no, it's not going to work. in terms of the second part of that question, which was, kids and how they respond, look, it is very variable. And I guess we certainly treat it in our family as any kind of information that you're giving kids about themselves. I think you just provide them age-appropriate explanations. So for our young fellow, we started right from the beginning as a young person who was in care. We needed to give him explanations that were age-appropriate about that. He knew he was different in terms of his abilities. He knew that he was in trouble an awful lot. He knew he struggled with things. So it was just giving him an age-appropriate explanation for that. And different parents and different families will do that differently. But I guess I'm for the sooner they know and they have the gist of it at an age-appropriate level, the better it's going to be for everyone, I think, in the long term.
Sure. Somebody's mentioned about does it get supported by NDIS? You mentioned it doesn't, and it put some resources up for that.
Well, theoretically it does.
Under
But
the
not as a
cognitive impairment
but not as a
rather than
standalone, or under complex mental health, or
Yeah. Is there a reliable measure or survey test that clients can do to measure impulse control and emotional regulation that you're aware of if you suspect there are possible FASD issues?
Probably under those circumstances, I would suggest that they get a referral to a psychologist or a psychology clinic, and there are certainly assessments that can be done to have a look at those different domains of functioning. It's probably something that can't be done quickly or with an online questionnaire.
Takes time.
Yeah, and it's certainly, if you're looking at gold standard diagnosis in kids, they think they quote about 45 hours.
Wow.
So there's a lot you're testing 10 domains, so it tends to take a long time.
And that kind of answers the next question as well, which is, I don't know how you say that, RAFADA? Is that how you say that group?
RAFTA.
Sorry. Have a complex screener that they use. Do you recommend any simpler ones? But again, I guess that there isn't such a thing really.
No, because the condition and the issues involved with FASD are so complex in themselves. In order to be able to identify, because we want to know where people's strengths lie and we want to know where their deficits lie, and certainly you can get your 3 areas of neurodevelopmental domains, and then they would, and as well as the other things, and they would meet diagnosis. But that's probably not going to help you with providing them with services because you don't know where all their deficits lie. So you kind of really, you kind of have to find the balance between doing as much assessment as you can do practically, because it is quite difficult, particularly to get adults assessed. It's a bit easier for kids, but even that is challenging, but it's getting better. And being financially able to access that, so we've kind of got to balance things up of getting enough assessment that it's useful, and to be able to make a diagnosis with the other practicalities.
Thank you. And I think just raising awareness and getting options of accessing other resources for support is a valid thing as well. So thank you very much. And
My pleasure.
hang on. Was there one more question? I apologise.
I was just wondering why, when you were speaking, that how amazing and how supportive it would be if there was a FASD young person on the ABC show, if they're making the next series of Employable Me.
Oh, that'd be a wonderful
if you were
thing.
able to get somehow, notify ABC, because
What a great idea. Yeah.
to make it more knowledgeable and people more accepting and more aware
Absolutely.
of another disability that is really holding young people back from work.
Yeah, and having understanding and supportive employers is just enormous. My son has moved into a position working part-time as a trainee tyre fitter with a big organisation, and it's, they've been very good. They've been very supportive, but not everyone's as lucky enough to get people who are actually able to sort of see beyond the behaviour to what's driving it, and to be able to manage that and to be able to accommodate that while still, because, again, when we do have those accommodations, people with FASD can be very successful. I often say my son is someone who, he'll get this job and he might stay in this job for 20 years, 30 years, because it's consistent and reliable and he knows what to do and he's confident and he's getting skills in it, provided he's supported.
don't forget that thing where the people who are employed, if they have a disability, are supported also by the government.
Yes.
To a certain
Yep.
extent, because that's what I wanted one of my half sisters to get into. But I'm pleased to a certain extent now she didn't rely on it. She's a bus driver.
Yeah.
Brilliant bus driver.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So finding a
Yeah.
niche and finding
Yeah.
something, but getting support to be successful is so
Yeah,
important.
but she's had back injuries, so that it's good
It's
that
tough.
she hadn't. Yeah, all right.
I think questions are going to keep coming, so I'll do this as the last one. And your email was on your presentation, and I'm sure you're happy for people to contact
Yeah,
you.
more than happy.
Where would you recommend, in Queensland, where would you recommend someone goes if they want to get someone diagnosed?
Well, that's a tricky question. So number one, it depends on the age. So for young people under the age of 12, the Gold Coast Hospital, the team with Doug Shelton and his team down there, they do assessments. We also have a team on the Sunshine Coast that offers assessments for a similar kind of age group. It's much harder to find assessments for adults. And I guess one of the things that I often suggest to people, and I talk about this a lot in the forums, is around sometimes you've got to break it. You can't go to one service. You need to have a psychiatrist who might have some expertise and knowledge of it, but you're likely to also need an assessment. And I often suggest the university clinics, and I'm not just trying to drum up business for myself, but they provide low-cost assessments that can look at a great number of those domains. You know, they can look at 6, maybe 7 of those domains and write up a report around that and take a very comprehensive history that people can then use to take to the psychiatrist to get some of that, other stuff done and to get a diagnosis. But it is challenging, but I think we are sort of working on getting services across the lifespan. It's not good enough to just diagnose people and then they've got nowhere to go. I mean, we only have 5 diagnostic clinics in Australia.
Thank you very much, and I'm sure everyone would like to thank
My pleasure.
Vanessa for the presentation today. Thank you.